The summer sun beat down on the crowded docks of New York Harbor, a relentless blaze reflecting off the steel hulls of ships that had crossed the Atlantic. Thousands of eyes gazed out at the endless horizon, waiting, wondering, imagining what lay ahead. Among them were men who had fought fiercely in a war that had engulfed the world, men who had been trained to survive, to dominate, to conquer. But now, these soldiers, German prisoners of war, stood shackled, herded onto American soil, their fate uncertain, their hearts heavy with fear and confusion. The war in Europe had finally ended. The guns had fallen silent, the cities that once burned under relentless bombardment now lay in ruins, and the soldiers who had been enemies just days before now found themselves prisoners, caught between relief and dread. They had been transported across the Atlantic in cramped ships, confined below deck with the stench of sweat and sea salt, surrounded by men they once called comrades. The journey had been long, uncomfortable, and tense. No one knew what awaited them on the other side. America was a land of legend to them, a country of immense wealth, sprawling cities, and endless opportunity. But for these men, it was a place of unknowns, a foreign landscape in every sense. Some whispered stories of the American heartland, of open fields stretching for miles, of towns bustling with life. Others feared tales of harsh treatment in POW camps, imagining a life of endless labor under watchful eyes. Yet nothing could prepare them for what they would see, the sight that would haunt their memories long after the war had ended. These men were not just ordinary soldiers, they were young, in their late teens and early 20s, though some were older, battle-hardened veterans who had seen the worst Europe had to offer. They had survived bombing raids, street fighting, and bitter winters. Many had lost friends and family, yet they had clung to life, to the hope that they might one day see home again. Now, facing the unknown in a land far from everything familiar, the fear in their eyes was not just about captivity, it was about facing something utterly unimaginable. The United States, with its vast coastline and sprawling cities, was unlike anything these men had ever encountered. For some, it was a dream, for others, a nightmare. The streets were wide, the buildings tall and gleaming, and the people moved with a brisk confidence that was both fascinating and intimidating. The German soldiers had been prepared for battle, for hunger, for fear, but not for a sight that would strip away every sense of certainty. Upon arrival, the POWs were herded into processing centers and temporary camps, where officers took inventory of names, ages, and military ranks. The air was filled with tension and unease, a palpable mix of apprehension and relief. They were given food, clean clothes, and a chance to rest. But these comforts did little to ease the growing anxiety. Rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Some claimed that American civilians were strange, even bizarre, in their behavior. Others said that the camps themselves were nothing like what they had feared. They were too orderly, too clean, almost surreal in their calmness. And yet, amid these first impressions, a deeper dread began to grow. The men were far from home, surrounded by strangers speaking a language that twisted and rolled differently than their own. Every glance, every gesture, every unexpected sound seemed magnified, feeding their unease. Some of the older soldiers remembered the propaganda they had been fed for years, warning that America was a land of chaos and moral decay. Now, in person, that narrative collided with reality, leaving them unsure of what to believe. Then came the moment that changed everything, the moment when these prisoners were led beyond the barbed wire, past the sentries, and into the open countryside. The American landscape stretched endlessly before them. Green fields, rolling hills, and farmlands dotted with barns and silos. At first, they were struck by the sheer unfamiliarity of it all, by the peacefulness that seemed almost impossible in the wake of so much destruction. The sun glinted off the rooftops, birds sang in the trees, and children played freely without fear. It was beautiful, serene, and terrifying, in its contrast to the chaos they had known. For men who had spent years in the trenches, navigating the rubble of bombed-out cities, this tranquility was a shock. They had trained to fight, to survive in a world defined by danger at every turn. And now, here they were, confronted with something almost alien in its simplicity and calm. It was not a battlefield, not a prison, not a place to conquer. It was normal life, mundane and unstoppable. And for the German soldiers, it was utterly disarming. Many of them began to whisper among themselves, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Could this be real? Could life go on as if nothing had happened? How could people continue with their ordinary routines when the world had been shattered by war? Fear mingled with awe, confusion with envy, as they struggled to reconcile their training and experience with this new reality. They were warriors in a land of farmers, soldiers among citizens who had never known true hunger or the constant threat of death. And that realization, the stark, unvarnished truth of it, was perhaps the most terrifying sight of all. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, the men were escorted into their assigned camps. The buildings were modest but clean, the grounds meticulously maintained, the guards professional but not cruel. Meals were served on time, medical care was available, and there was a structure, a rhythm, a sense of order that was both comforting and disorienting. For men who had survived the unpredictable horrors of war, this strange calm felt like another kind of battlefield, one where the rules were entirely unfamiliar. And yet, despite the meticulous order, a subtle tension lingered. The prisoners could feel it in the air, in the way the Americans moved around them, in the quiet efficiency of the camp's operations. They were under watchful eyes, yes, but there was also a strange, almost clinical distance to it. No yelling, no abuse, no cruelty, just an unshakable sense of control, as if the entire camp were a machine operating smoothly and inevitably. And in that realization, fear began to grow once more. They were far from home, under the authority of a people they did not understand. In a country whose size and power seemed limitless, this, more than anything else, set the stage for what was to come. For weeks, these men would be tested not by weapons, not by hunger, not by combat, but by the very essence of a world they could not have imagined. The United States, with its open fields, its bustling towns, and its quiet, ordered camps, was a sight that would haunt them in ways that no battlefield ever could. It was a vision of life uninterrupted by war, a glimpse of freedom that was both alluring and terrifying, and it would leave an indelible mark on the soldiers who had once believed they understood fear. In the coming days, as they began to navigate this strange land, the German POWs would encounter experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and courage. They would witness the resilience of ordinary people, the unwavering routines of communities untouched by destruction, and the unexpected humanity of those who held them captive. And through it all, a single, unshakable image would remain burned into their minds, the sight that had terrified them from the very first moment they set foot on American soil. The first days in the American camps were surreal. The German POWs were assigned to work details, often in rural areas where farms stretched endlessly under the autumn sun. To the men who had witnessed bombed-out cities, starving civilians, and the devastation of war, this was nothing short of unbelievable. They were sent into orchards heavy with fruit, to plough fields, to tend livestock, a far cry from the destruction and ruin they had grown accustomed to. The irony was bitter. In a land untouched by the horrors of battle, they were asked to labor, not out of necessity for survival, but simply to keep the wheels of ordinary life turning. Many soldiers initially resisted. Some tried to hide, to feign illness, or to stall in subtle acts of defiance. But the Americans were calm yet firm. There was no shouting, no brutality, no psychological torment designed to break them. Instead, there was structure, predictability, and most disconcerting of all, kindness. Meals were regular, medical care was provided, and the guards treated them with a level of respect that was utterly foreign to these men. It was a paradox. They were prisoners, yet their captors treated them more like reluctant guests than conquered enemies. Stories quickly spread among the prisoners about the small towns they were sent to. Children waved shyly from fences. Women brought baskets of fruit or fresh bread to the fields, and farmers spoke to them in broken German or simple gestures. Some prisoners recalled the first time they were offered a handshake instead of a rifle butt. It was as if they had crossed into an alternate reality, one in which war had never touched the people around them. And while some were grateful for the respite, others felt a deep, gnawing unease. The world they knew was one of danger, suspicion, and strict hierarchies. Here, there was none of that. Among the POWs, rumors began to circulate about the fate of soldiers who failed to comply. They had expected harsh punishment, perhaps imprisonment in cold cells, starvation, or forced labor under brutal conditions. But no such punishment came. Instead, the men were allowed to move with a freedom they had never known, work with tools and animals under supervision, and even correspond with their families back home. The Americans enforced the rules, but they did so without cruelty, with a professionalism that bordered on clinical. It was during these labor assignments that the prisoners began to notice something that would haunt them more than any battlefield memory: the ordinary lives of the people around them. In Germany, they had grown up amid fear and suspicion, where life could change in an instant under the pressure of war. Here, farmers went about their days with a calm certainty, families laughed over meals, and children ran barefoot through the fields. These images struck the POWs with a force they could not comprehend. To see people living unbroken, whole, and free, it was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The terror lay in its unfamiliarity. They had been trained to expect danger, to anticipate betrayal, to navigate chaos at every moment. In the United States, there was none of that. Life operated on predictable routines, and those routines functioned flawlessly. There was no constant threat, no fear of the next bombing raid, no scarcity of food or medicine. For men who had spent years navigating a world defined by violence and uncertainty, this ordinary, stable existence felt almost supernatural. Yet, despite the apparent calm, the prisoners were not free from fear. Some tried to resist emotionally, clinging to the narratives of wartime propaganda that had portrayed Americans as greedy, cruel, or morally corrupt. They doubted the sincerity of the kindness shown to them, suspecting hidden motives behind every gesture. Others felt an unexpected envy, a pang of longing for the security they had never known. This mix of fear, awe, and confusion became a daily undercurrent in the camps, shaping every interaction, every decision, and every thought. There were moments that seemed to test them further. German officers, trying to maintain some sense of hierarchy among the prisoners, struggled to assert authority in a system that did not rely on fear. Disputes over work assignments, discipline, and privileges arose, and the Americans handled them with quiet efficiency. There were no fistfights, no shouting matches escalating into chaos, just calm mediation, the kind that seemed impossible to the soldiers who had spent years commanding obedience through force. This subtle mastery of order only deepened the prisoners' sense of unease. As weeks turned into months, the POWs began to form impressions of the people around them that were impossible to reconcile with their wartime worldview. They saw men and women of all ages working tirelessly, yet without the desperation and brutality that had defined life in occupied Europe. They witnessed acts of generosity that had nothing to do with propaganda or strategy: farmers offering extra food to laborers, townspeople sharing resources during harvests, and neighbors helping one another with genuine care. The prisoners struggled to understand a system so different from the one they had known, where authority was exercised without fear, and cooperation did not rely on coercion. Letters home painted a distorted picture. Some men wrote of America as a paradise, while others described it as a strange and unsettling place, almost unnervingly calm. Families in Germany could hardly believe the reports. How could a land so vast, so powerful, function without constant fear and suspicion? But for the soldiers on the ground, the paradox was real. They were safe, fed, clothed, and cared for, but the very safety itself was terrifying. It challenged everything they had been taught about survival, about the world, about humanity. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the POW experience was the glimpses they had of American culture outside the camps. On rare occasions, small groups were allowed supervised visits to towns, where they could see movie theaters, diners, and bustling markets. For men who had grown up under wartime austerity and strict control, these scenes were overwhelming. They marveled at bright lights, the abundance of goods, and the casual freedom with which people moved about their lives. Children played openly in streets without fear of air raids, families picnicked in parks, and music filled the air. The normalcy was almost unbearable. Amid all this, stories began to circulate about escape attempts, or rather, attempts at imagination. Some prisoners tried to envision returning home without incident, sneaking away in the night, or exploiting loopholes in camp rules. But the reality of the situation was always pressing. The Americans were meticulous in their planning, and every movement was accounted for. Escape was not just difficult, it was almost inconceivable. Yet, the very thought of freedom, combined with the unnatural calm of their surroundings, intensified the prisoners' inner turmoil. It was during these months that the sight that terrified them most became clear, not a single object or building, but a vision. The vision of life continuing undisturbed, of communities thriving amid abundance, of people moving forward without the weight of constant fear. The irony was cruel. In the chaos and devastation of war, fear had been a familiar companion. Here, in a world so orderly and free, fear had no place, and yet it persisted in their hearts. They were confronted with a truth that was almost unbearable. Life could go on, completely indifferent to the suffering they had endured. The psychological impact was profound. Some men withdrew into themselves, spending hours staring at fields or barns, trying to reconcile their experiences with what they saw. Others grew restless, anger simmering beneath the surface, frustrated by a world that did not respond to threats or command. And some, reluctantly, began to learn not from lectures or threats, but by observation that survival did not always depend on strength, cunning, or fear. Sometimes it depended on patience, cooperation, and trust, a lesson many had never imagined. By the time the first winter approached, the German POWs had settled into a routine, yet the memory of their first arrival lingered vividly in their minds. The shock of seeing life as it could exist outside war had left an indelible impression. They had been warriors, trained for chaos, thrust into a world defined by calm, and in that calm, they had found a terror more subtle and profound than any battlefield horror. It was the terror of understanding, for the first time, that the world could continue without them being able to control it, dominate it, or predict it. The story of these men is more than just a tale of captivity. It is a story of confrontation with a world that defied expectation, with the idea of normalcy, and with the unsettling notion that life could be entirely different from everything they had known. And it is precisely this confrontation that sets the stage for the final chapter, the climax of their journey, the moment when the terror they had felt since arrival reached its peak, and they were forced to face the full magnitude of what America had shown them. Winter crept over the American landscape, and with it, a quiet intensity settled over the camps. The German POWs had endured months of labor, observation, and the strange rhythms of life that seemed so alien to them. They had seen the calm of towns, the resilience of farmers, and the ordinary routines of people untouched by the devastation that had defined their own world. And yet, nothing had fully prepared them for the moment that would etch itself most deeply into their memories, a moment when the reality of America's life, its freedom, and its resilience struck with an almost unbearable clarity. It happened one frigid morning, under a pale sky streaked with clouds. The prisoners were led from their barracks to a nearby field, where they were to assist in harvest work. The frost crunched beneath their boots, the breath of men rising in thin white clouds. At first, everything seemed routine, almost mundane, but as the group reached the edge of the field, they saw it a sight so unexpected, so fundamentally human, that it stopped them in their tracks. A small town lay beyond the horizon of farmland, seemingly ordinary at first glance. But as the prisoners watched, life in that town unfolded before their eyes in a way that defied understanding. Children ran through streets lined with freshly painted houses, their laughter ringing clear across the crisp air. Women and men carried baskets of food and supplies, moving with purpose, yet unhurried. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, the scent of baking bread mingling with the earthy smell of the fields. Dogs barked, neighbors greeted one another warmly, and the hum of everyday life rose like a symphony. The soldiers froze, struck dumb. This was not a town of hardship, not a village scarred by war, not a place to conquer or fear. It was life full, unbroken, normal life flowing forward without interruption. For men who had lived through the chaos of battle, who had seen cities burn and families torn apart, this scene was incomprehensible. It was beauty in motion, but also a mirror reflecting everything they had lost, everything they had endured, and everything they would never reclaim. Some of the older men tried to rationalize it, to explain it away with the language of their training and propaganda. Surely, they told themselves, this was a trick, an illusion crafted by cunning enemies. Yet the more they observed, the more impossible it became to deny. The town was real, the life was real, the freedom, the abundance, the sheer ordinariness of it all. It was terrifying. The psychological weight of the moment settled over them like a heavy fog. Fear, which had always been tangible, immediate, and dangerous, now became abstract, creeping into their minds in the form of unease, guilt, and helplessness. They had fought, killed, survived, and endured, yet here was life moving forward without them, unconcerned with their presence or their past. The soldiers realized something profound. Power on the battlefield meant little in the face of a world that could thrive independently, a society capable of carrying on without fear, without destruction, without domination. It was not just the sight of normal life that shocked them, it was the human connection woven into it. They saw neighbors helping one another, children learning and playing without fear, men and women working in harmony with the land. Everything they had known about survival had been predicated on conflict, scarcity, and vigilance. Here, survival was quiet, methodical, and communal. The realization was almost unbearable. For the first time, they understood that life could exist and even flourish outside the shadow of fear. In the weeks that followed, the POWs grappled with what they had seen. Some withdrew inward, haunted by a combination of awe and despair. They could not reconcile their own experiences of loss and terror with the effortless normalcy of American life. Others adapted, slowly accepting the rhythms of work and interaction, learning lessons in patience, cooperation, and empathy that had never been part of their training. Even those who resisted intellectually could not escape the emotional impact. Every day brought reminders of what they had witnessed, and the memory of that town, alive and unconcerned with their presence, lingered in their minds like a quiet, insistent echo. The guards and civilians, unaware of the psychological upheaval taking place, continued their routines, inadvertently teaching lessons that no drill or command could have conveyed. Simple acts, a handshake, shared laughter, a helping hand carried meanings far deeper than they could have imagined. They demonstrated that fear was not the only path to survival, that power was not the only means to influence, that humanity could persist even after unimaginable destruction. As the months turned into years, some prisoners were eventually repatriated to Germany, returning home to cities still recovering from war. Yet the memory of America, of that serene town, of fields stretching endlessly under the sun, remained with them. It haunted them, not because it was frightening in the conventional sense, but because it represented a world that existed beyond fear, beyond chaos, beyond the very paradigm of survival they had always known. They had glimpsed a life that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, a life they could not control, could not destroy, and could not fully understand. In recounting their experiences years later, many described the sight with the same mixture of awe and terror. They spoke of frozen mornings in the fields, of laughter carried on the wind, of neighbors helping neighbors, as if the world itself were whole and unshakable. They spoke of children running freely, of smoke curling from chimneys, of towns humming with life that ignored the past and paid no attention to their presence. It was a vision of hope, of normalcy, and of human resilience that contrasted sharply with the violence they had known. And it left an indelible mark, a reminder that fear is not always born of danger, but sometimes of a world that refuses to conform to expectation. This story, at its heart, is more than a historical footnote. It is a lesson in perception, in resilience, and in the extraordinary power of ordinary life. The German POWs were warriors, trained for chaos, conditioned for survival in extremes, and yet they were undone not by weapons, not by harsh treatment, not by hunger, but by the quiet strength of a world that continued, indifferent and unstoppable, around them. As the years passed, historians and survivors alike reflected on this paradox. The camps, the labor, the towns, and the people who unwittingly transformed lives, they all became part of a narrative about the enduring strength of human society. The fear of those POWs, the terror they felt upon seeing a world operating normally, became a story not just of war, but of life itself, of the extraordinary in the everyday, of the power in calm, and of the profound, disarming truth that survival does not always demand violence. In the end, the most terrifying sight these soldiers ever encountered was not a battlefield, a bomb, or a machine of war. It was the unshakable, relentless continuity of life itself. It was a world that moved forward, beautiful and indifferent, free and undisturbed, leaving them to confront a truth far larger than any war they had fought, that life could endure, and even thrive, beyond fear. And as they walked back to the barracks, to their work, to the routines imposed upon them by strangers who had shown them more humanity than they had ever known, the soldiers carried with them a realization both humbling and profound. They had been trained to fight chaos, yet the real lesson was this: the world was capable of order, beauty, and resilience on its own terms, and that truth, terrifying and liberating in equal measure, was something no man could ever forget.